So this past weekend, I attended a local RTT and took my Harridan out for its first spin in real-life competitive 40k. So let's talk about all of the games that Harridan played in and how he did on the day. Let's do it! What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're back with a tournament report. First off, if you enjoy this style of content and you like this kind of event report video, go ahead, show the video some love, drop a like, drop a subscribe, drop one of those comments down below, do all that interaction. These videos don't tend to do quite as well on a viewership level as some of my other ones, so if you like them and you want me to keep doing them, let me know by interacting with the video. I'd really appreciate it. But anyway, all that shameless plugging aside, let's talk about this RTT that I played in. The whole goal of going was to play Harridan. Now that he's mostly all the way painted, he needed to see some table time. I've been painting this Harridan on Twitch and also more recently on YouTube live streams over the last couple of weeks. And if you want to follow my progress on this guy and come hang out with me while I'm streaming, I do stream on the YouTube channel now, but also I stream over at twitch.tv/tacticaltortoisetv. So I'd really appreciate it if you come hang out. With that in mind, we brought a Harridan-focused Tyranids list to the event. This is entirely High Fleet Kronos. Starts out, obviously, with that super heavy auxiliary detachment with the Harridan in it. He's been upgraded to have Dermic Symbiosis, so he has an invulnerable save, doubles his wounds for bracketing. All good stuff. Following that up, we have the battalion detachment, and realistically, the design ethos behind the rest of the list was that I ended up sticking in basically all of the units that I enjoyed to play in Tyranids. This list was mostly a meme, but I think it's actually working out pretty well. That is a smashy Hive Tyrant with 2 sets of Scything Talons upgraded to be murderously sized. So they are Strength 7, AP 4 for a flat 4 damage. He has Xenogenic Acid, so he also deals mortal wounds on wound rolls of 5+. Just a lot of damage output coming out of a small package. And that move 16 means that he's very effective with Overrun and with Hive Commander off of the Swarm Lord, who's also in the list. We then have a support Hive Tyrant who has a set of Reddening Claws, as well as 2 Devourers with Brain Leech Worms. He's just there to cast Psychic Powers. Moving over to the rest of the list, it's pretty light on the ground. We have 20 Gene Stealers, 2 units of 3 Ripper Swarms, and 6 Hive Guard. And that's it! It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 units. So, you know, that's fine. Now, before we get into it, I think it's important to talk about the Harridan a little bit. I won't turn this into like a Harridan breakdown video, but there are some weird idiosyncrasies with the model that I think people should be aware of. I might do a datasheet deep dive on the Harridan in the future, but this guy is an absolute house. 700 points for a single model is a lot to swallow, especially since you have to upgrade it to actually get access to that invulnerable save, but the ranged attacks on this profile are really good. 2 8-shot Strength 10 AP3 3 flat damage bio cannons. For a total of 16 shots, it can ping itself for D3 mortal wounds when it goes to shoot to get +1 to wound. You can also buff that with other psychic powers and strats like Pathogenic Slime for +1 damage, making it a 4 damage 16-shot gun. That's a lot of DACA. They could be exploding 6s with Symbiostorm. You can buff his survivability with Catalyst. You can buff his melee output with those Strength 10, 6 flat damage melee attacks with Voracious Appetite. He's just an absolute truck. One of the funnier synergies is with the Overrun stratagem, which allows you to move in advance as if it were the movement phase after destroying a unit in melee. Because the Harridan is an aircraft, when he moves during the movement phase, he ends up strategic reserving himself if he moves off the table, which means it is possible to move this guy up, shoot something to death, charge something else and kill it, and then strategic reserve so your opponent can't even attack him back, even though he's in hover mode. Pretty ridiculous. It is a hover mode capable aircraft with a 45-inch move. The big downside there is that it can't hold objectives, which is a pretty big downside. It means your list is not very good at scoring primaries, but it does mean that he's maneuverable enough to be able to get around corners and get arcs and lines of sight to things that your army really needs to take out. It's a pretty impressive centerpiece of an army and solves a lot of problems that Tyranids typically have trouble with. Things like toughness 8, high wound count, very resilient models Tyranids occasionally struggle with because their profiles often cap out at around Strength 7 or Strength 8, meaning that while Tyranids often have the threat range to get to things, they very seldom have the actual ability to kill them. But the Harridan solves all that. He's able to reach out and touch almost anything on the table with that fast movement and that 48-inch weapon range, and can burn down things like knights or dreadnoughts pretty easily, whereas a lot of the faction struggles at that. The big downside, obviously, is that you can see him through walls, and you can't really hide him because the model's freaking enormous. So against very heavy ranged alpha strikes, he can suffer. Adeptus Mechanicus obviously is the boogeyman and immediately comes to mind. If he goes second against a well-tuned Adeptus Mechanicus army, they can just kill it, and you probably lose the game from there. But that's true of most Tyranid armies, so that's not really much of a weakness. And on the flip side, if the Harridan goes first into an Adeptus Mechanicus army, it can reap a great toll of Iron Strider Ballastarii, and potentially get itself to a position where it can survive the game. I'd originally picked up the Harridan because I thought it would be fun to play, but I actually do think it is a reasonably competitive choice for a Tyranid army, especially post GT2021, now that the Super Heavy Auxiliary Detachment refunds most of its CP as long as it shares the same subfaction as your Warlord. And Titan Hunter is not a particularly viable pick against him, so the whole army gives up like 10 points on Assassinate, maybe, and that's it. It only has 8 units, so grind them down isn't great. No prisoners, it only gives up 7. Bring it down, it only gives up 9. It's like squeezing water from a rock trying to score VPs out of this thing. Obviously, the flip side there is that it's very light and difficult to score primary objectives with, but it's mostly an attrition engine, so you can try to attrition yourself to the point where that's not really that much of an issue, and your monsters can run around and grab objectives in the late game. Now, before we move on, I bet there's going to be a billion comments on this video asking about the Harridan versus long table edge deployment issue. I'm not going to get into all of the semantic arguments about how base measuring works and how GW's FAQs are just terrible. But to make a long story short, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most of the TOs in my area, the correct reading of the rules is that as long as the Harridan's base can fit wholly within your deployment zone without any part of the model protruding over your table edge, you're able to deploy and operate normally on the first turn. If you are planning on playing a model like a Harridan, it's good to verify that with your TOs before you go to any events, because there is an open question about how models that are physically larger than your deployment zone work, even if they can fit wholly in your deployment zone from a base measuring standpoint. But anytime I'm going to an event with a model like this, I just clear it with the TO and make sure that we're on the same page. And so far, every TO I've talked to has agreed with me that the correct interpretation is that the Harridan is not particularly stymied by long table edge shallow deployments. It just has to deploy at a very specific angle to prevent itself going off the table, and that means it can't really turn on the first turn, which is obviously a big downside, but it doesn't have to sacrifice its actions. But anyway, now that we've talked about the list, let's move on to some games. In round 1, I was paired up against Steven's Space Wolves. Now, this was a Wolfbots style Space Wolves list focusing on Dreadnoughts, which is an archetype of Space Wolves after my own heart. I played a lot of lists like this, although a lot of them focused on Wolf and Dreadnoughts, which I think are absolutely rad. This one focusing a little bit more on the ranged Dreadnoughts and some of the ground forces, like infantry and Thunderwolf cavalry, which I'm not as big a fan of, but I definitely think the core of the army with those Space Wolves Dreadnoughts is very powerful. One of the most important interactions, obviously, being that the range damage output of the Dreadnoughts can really only be stifled by moving up aggressively and engaging them in melee. That's difficult to do because an entire Space Wolf army heroically intervenes. So if you try to get up and punch at those Redemptor Dreadnoughts to stop them from shooting you with Plasma Eradicators, you're going to get Armor of Rust, you're going to get intervened by other Redemptors, and it's just going to be a bad time for you. Now, this mission for round 1 was Scorched Earth, so he had 6 objectives, basically centered on 2 columns on the left and right side of the table, and this was a long table edge shallow deployment. It's also important to note that we used US Open style terrain setups for this event, and while I'm sure I'm biased because I think Tyranids are very advantaged by US Open style terrain, I've been surprised at how much I absolutely love playing with these setups. Just the knowledge that you will have 1 to 2 obscuring terrain features in your deployment zone that are relatively meaty and can block a lot of lines of sight makes playing games of 40k so much less stressful. And while obviously there's a lot of factions, fast factions or melee-focused factions that can abuse those big obscuring pieces of terrain or get around them very quickly, that obviously can be played around and I think creates interesting tactical options versus just deciding the game by who wins the choose table side or go first roll-off. After playing several games with these setups, I hope that they become the gold standard for competitive 40k terrain in the future. And while I do like to criticize Games Workshop, I do think that these US Open terrain layouts are certainly one of the better things to come out of the GW organized play team. In terms of secondary objectives, I elected to take engage on all fronts, raise the banners high, and grind them down. Engage in all fronts is, I think, a pretty good pick for this list. Obviously, it has the fast Hive Tyrants, a lot of deep striking in the Lictors and the Ripper Swarms to get those engage points, and having an aircraft on the table means you can often engage turn 1 really easily. Raise the Banners high is a very questionable pick. There are only 2 units in the army that can reliably drop banners, and those are the Genestealers and the Lictor. That said, I didn't have a lot of great options in this matchup. My opponent really towed the line on how many points I could get from a lot of his secondaries. He didn't give much on Bring It Down, he didn't really give much on No Prisoners, which is why I ended up taking that Grind Them Down, because he had a lot of those small infantry units I could try to pick off to beat him on grind points. But Banners was definitely an experimental pick, I think, to say the least. We could maybe have taken Assassinate because he had 3 very aggressive characters that I was probably going to be able to kill throughout the course of the game. On my opponent's side, he ended up taking Oaths of Moment, also raised the Banners high, which I think is very appropriate for a list with a lot of Intercessors and Phobos Marines in it. And lastly, Bring It Down, which I'm not 100% sure is the pick in this matchup. But again, I don't think he was running out of things to play. My list does not give up secondaries very often. And at least getting 9 points for doing something which you were going to be doing anyway, which is like shooting a Harridan and Hive Tyrants, makes some modicum of sense. I did scratch my head a little bit after the fact at no Warrior Pride pick instead of that Osa moment. I think Warrior Pride is one of the best secondaries in the game, and especially for a Space Wolves army that can be as aggressive as this one can, I think I would have liked to have seen that one, and it would have probably scored my opponent pretty highly. I deployed most of my army behind one of the line of sight blockers on my left-hand side of the table. My opponent deployed all their Dreadnoughts directly in the center and centered a lot of their firepower on that left-hand side as well. So we were just going to have a big old scrum on the left-hand side, and whoever won that was probably going to win the game. My opponent won the roll to go first, and unfortunately wasn't quite able to do enough to the Harridan. His shooting failed a little bit. The Redemptors rolled a bunch of 1s to fire their Macroplasma, and only ended up doing about 10 damage to the Harridan, which I was pretty happy with. He moved up aggressively forward with his Thunderwolf Cavalry and his characters, and basically put a lot of the pressure on me to respond. I think the aggressive play was the right call for my opponent, but I do have a lot of tools to deal with it. The Harridan ended up shooting down most of the Thunderwolf Cavalry squad with help from Pathogenic Slime to make his guns 4 damage to kill those 4 wound models, although some good and vulnerable saves did leave 1 Thunderwolf alive after that guy shot him. The Harridan did go in on the last Thunderwolf and kill him to overrun off the table, although I had put Catalyst on him earlier, so he actually took my Catalyst off the table with him, which is a little bit awkward. And with the Harridan off the table and the rest of my armies conservatively placed behind obstructions, my opponent actually didn't have any shooting to do with his big Dreadnought ball on the second round. He did, however, rocket his Thunderwolf Lord into the meat of my castle on the left-hand side. He actually was able to get a big advance roll to get all the way around my characters and get into my Hive Guard. I knew this was a possibility, and I couldn't quite block his movement with my Swarm Lord without putting the Swarm Lord in grave danger. But given how terrible Hive Guard are at shooting at Dreadnoughts and my opponent's access to Transhuman on all of his infantry now that the Wolf Guard were dead, I wasn't really sure I needed them. So if that meant the Wolf Lord was not attacking Bring It Down targets, I think I was okay with it. The rest of the army just continued to move up. Banners had gone down on 4 objectives, so my opponent started scoring highly on that, and it moved back to my turn. I dropped the Harridan in the back corner of my opponent's deployment zone, moved aggressively forward with my Genestealers, who had dropped a banner on my left-hand objective, and started hammering my opponent's characters with smites. He'd actually sent in his other Wolf Lord, his Chapter Master Wolf Lord, into the Swarm Lord. That did not end well for that Wolf Lord, unfortunately. Swarm Lord took a couple damage from the Thunderhammer, but was able to kill him between a smite and a fight phase activation. That meant the rest of my smites went backwards into the Thunderwolf Lord, and the Harridan was able to zero in on him and rip him off the table with a shooting phase activation as well. That left my backline clear and allowed my Genestealers to get double moved into my opponent's top left objective, where they killed the Assault Intercessors there and broke a banner. On the way, they actually broke the banner on the center objective on that side as well that the Incursors had placed. So I was able to start reducing my opponent's banner score. In response, my opponent turned all of his guns onto the Genestealers and the Harridan on the left-hand side to try to remove them. The Harridan took a couple more points of damage, but generally speaking, my opponent's rolls into him were not amazing, and he mostly took damage from like random mortal wounds off Volkite Contemptors. However, a couple Onslaught Gatling Cannons and Frag Missiles ripped into the Genestealer squad and took them down to just a couple models, where the Incursors on the left-hand side and one of the Volkite Contemptors charged in and dropped them down to a single remaining Genestealer. Fortunately, he was in Synapse, so he didn't run away. That big 18-inch bubble off the Hive Tyrants is pretty good. That meant it was time for the monsters to start coming forward and duking it out with the Dreadnoughts. The support Hive Tyrant and the Swarmlord moved over on the left-hand side to fight the Redemptors, and the Harridan did the same thing. Shooting and psychic powers were able to kill one of the Redemptors, and Swarmlord chunked 8 damage into another one just with a melee attack activation, whereas the Harridan charged a Contemptor Dreadnought and missed 4 times on his melee attacks, only dealing a couple points of damage to that Contemptor, which made me a little sad. On the other side, my Smashy Hive Tyrant moved up, destroyed a unit of Incursors on one of the center objectives, and then used Overrun to get behind a line of sight blocker in my opponent's deployment zone so that he wasn't in range to get hit by Volkite Culverins. That started scoring me big engage points and cleared a lot of my opponent's banners and objective holders out, meaning that he was basically left down with the Dreadnoughts. In response, my opponent's only remaining character, his Chief Librarian, turned around to try to fight the Smashy Hive Tyrant on the right-hand side, and the Dreadnoughts actually fell back on the left-hand side, so they didn't end up getting killed in my opponent's turn, trying to fight Swarmlord and the Harridan. That didn't really keep them alive too long, however, because I was able to wipe all of them out on the subsequent phase. That just left a couple Assault Intercessors and Incursors in my opponent's army I was able to quickly deal with, and had that one remaining Genestealer drop some banners. So I was actually able to max out my banners count between the Genestealer and the Lictor, running around the backline objectives and grabbing those points. While the Swarmlord did actually go down to a Redemptor exploding, which was pretty hilarious, that was a pretty good showing for the Harridan list. That ended up being a 94-61 win to me. The tournament actually wasn't using the 10 points for being fully painted, so the raw scores were basically 10 points lower than where they would be in any other event, so I'm artificially adding those on at the end for the sake of comparison. Dreadnoughts are a unit profile that Tyranids often struggle with. The -1 damage is really bad for a lot of Tyranid anti-tank weapons, which tend to be 2 damage or D3 damage, both of which are really hammered by effects like Duty Eternal. And with the Librarian in there to protect them with Psychic Fortress, you can't even really rely on things like the Smashy Hive Tyrant getting in and doing a bunch of damage in melee, because that 5+ invulnerable save could just stifle him right in his tracks. Fortunately, the Harridan firing 3 damage through that Duty Eternal is pretty good. And once he turns on and starts pointing those guns at those Dreadnoughts, they disappear very quickly. But that moved me on in the winner's bracket to round 2. In this round, I was paired up against Brady and his Adeptus Custodes. Brady was bringing a triple Telamon archetype of Custodes, which I've been seeing a lot recently. I think the recent results at US Open have convinced a lot of people to tech into that triple Telamon style of build for the Custodes faction. But, like we talked about before, Dreadnoughts are one of the favorite food of the Harridan, and I think that goes doubly so for the Telamon Dreadnought. Being so expensive and such a focal point of your army, and relying on those defensive stratagems, the Harridan is kind of unique in that none of the Custodes' defensive stratagems actually work on his ranged attacks. He's strength 10 with +1 to wound, so -1 strength from the Shadowkeeper strat doesn't matter. He doesn't reroll any of his attacks and shooting, so Emperor's Auspice doesn't make a difference either. The one piece of technology that could really stifle him would be a Vexilla's Praetor with the Vexilla Magnifica for -1 to hit, because that does actually turn off Symbiostorm if it's active, and really cuts down the number of hits that the Harridan generates, but my opponent didn't have that in his list. Otherwise, it's a relatively standard Custodes list. We did have 1 unit of Venatari, 2 units of Sagittarium Guard, 1 unit of Shield Guard, as well as Trajan Florist for those delicious, delicious rerolls, and a Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike with all of the buffs to make him super duper difficult to kill. This mission was sweep and clear, so we had 5 objectives, 1 in the center and 1 in each table quarter, and we had 1 table quarter to deploy in. The objectives also locked in, so if you hold them at the start of your turn, then you would hold them permanently until your opponent comes and takes them. The left and right table quarters on the maps we were using had big old Nova L's in them, so I was happy to position my entire army behind a Nova L on my side to keep them relatively safe from my opponent's shooting. Obviously, the Harridan can't really hide, but he's also not that worried about the Blaze Cannon shots from the Telamons. They are not numerous enough to really threaten the enormous wound pool that the Harridan has. So I wasn't really worried about that guy dying in this matchup. For that reason, I actually ended up taking to the last, which in this list hits the Hive Guard, the Genestealers, and the Harridan himself. We also took Direct Assault to score 3 points for holding the center objective, or some additional points for holding my opponent's deployment zone objective, and the ubiquitous Engage on all fronts. On my opponent's side, he took Stranglehold and Direct Assault, so really hoping to push into that center objective and hold 3 objectives for the 6 points, and then, as his last pick, grind them down. My opponent ended up winning the roll to go first in this matchup as well, although I think that was pretty good for me. I generally like going second into Custodes, especially if I have decent places to hide, because their shooting isn't phenomenal, so the amount of damage they can put out on turn 1 before I can hit them is not that great. It does give them a lot of table presence, but I'm able to respond to that with my own maneuverability. My opponent ended up just advancing basically his entire army on turn 1, putting models in the center of the table and on the far right-hand objective in order to grab those stranglehold points. He had his Venatari Custodians in reserve, so I had to play kind of aggressively with my Rippers, not just to score engage on all fronts, but also to screen out any potential Venatari drops where they could drop in and rip apart my Hive Guard. I also continued to put one of the Hive Tyrants out aggressively to drop some smites, and then ran them back into the back corner of my deployment zone with Swarm Lord's Hive Commander in order to screen out the back edge of my deployment zone. But that did give my opponent the ability to hit some units for grind early because my Ripper Swarms had to run out and break cover. That also made my direct assault pick a little bit more questionable because I would have to use the Ripper Swarms to run out and deny deep strike drops rather than use them as throwaway units to hold the center objective for 3 points. I was able to deal a bunch of damage to my opponent's shield captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike with psychic powers and knock one of the Telemons down to just 2 wounds with the first round of Harridan shooting, although the rest of my shooting didn't really do much, which was a little bit disconcerting. I was hoping to kill 1 Telemon a turn. That's usually how the math works out on the matchup because the Harridan, on average, deals about 12 or 13 damage to a Telemon by himself. My opponent ended up sticking 2 of the Telemons in the center, and I took an additional turn to deal with them because I ended up focusing on the remaining Telemon that was flanking very heavily towards my top left objective. I didn't want to give my opponent easy access to that objective to lock it in and force me to move something over there with a double move or a metabolic overdrive to break that, so I ended up killing that Telemon early. With the Lictor and my Hive Tyrant screening out the perfect Venatari drops, I was feeling relatively safe with my To the Last, so I ended up on round 2 putting the Gene Stealers into the center in order to hold the center objective. My opponent's Shield Custodians were in the middle there and 2 of his Telemons, but between Smites and the Harridan shooting, I was able to kill one of the 2 Telemons, leaving him with just 1, and then wrap the unit of Shield Custodians with the Gene Stealers. He ended up tangle-footing them for -6 on their charge. Fortunately, I'd put them 2 inches away, so we needed to roll at least a 7 on the charge to actually make it in, and we rolled exactly a 7. Let me tell you, making 1-inch movements in 40k with a unit of 20 Gene Stealers, not the most fun experience in the game. And actually made it so I didn't really have to pull punches to attack the unit in order to wrap them because I could only get a couple guys to actually fight. They did still steal the objective though and make themselves relatively immune to shooting, and my opponent was low enough on CP at that point that he opted not to Desperate Breakout to attack them with the Telemon's guns. In round 3, the Venatari did elect to drop down on my top left objective and hold that. They killed the Lictor who was there. And the Custodes and Telemon started pulverizing Gene Stealers, but I did have Catalyst on them, so they were relatively resilient against the models in the center. My round 3, however, I did make a relatively big mistake. I was meant to drop the Gene Stealers back out of combat, unwrap the remaining Custodian, and allow myself to shoot the Telemon. Put all of my attacks into the Telemon between Smites, potentially Hive Guard shots, as well as a Harridan shot with Pathogenic Slime to knock him out, but I just forgot to do that, so he ended up sticking in melee. The Harridan did instead just kill a bunch of Sagittarium in the back, and the Hive Guard and the Smashy Hive Tyrant dove into the Venatari Custodians and killed most of the unit, engaging the rest. I did end up losing my support Hive Tyrant to the Sagittarium in the back, as he had moved up to the bottom right objective in order to break my opponent's control of it, since my opponent had grabbed it with the Shield Captain. That guy also had ended up killing the Shield Captain with some smites as well. But because the Telemon Dreadnought had remained in melee, it got an extra turn of attacking with its melee attacks into the Gene Stealers, and then a turn of shooting into melee, followed by 1 additional attack. While the Gene Stealers were able to kill the last remaining Shield Custodian on the objective, they ended up going down to the Telemon's attacks, and I lost it to the last point because I had forgotten to fall them back. Pretty big mistake, unfortunately. I thought they would be relatively safe with some deft application of the movement phase, but that was just a big brain fart on my part, and I ended up losing 5 points for it. It was pretty aggressive putting my To the Last target in the middle, but given that they were basically only fighting a couple Custodians and the Telemon, I think they were okay, since I could relatively reliably kill the Telemon in my subsequent turn if I could shoot at it. That didn't really end up mattering to the final score of the game, as the Harridan was able to rip the remaining Telemon off the table, and my opponent's army was very, very quickly dwindling, only down to a couple infantry at that point. I had also lost the support Hive Tyrant to the Sagittarium Guard, and obviously the Harridan can't actually hold objectives, so he was not very good at breaking my opponent's control of objectives, but I was able to string my remaining army out to get the requisite 15 points needed to secure the victory. That ended me with a total of 84 points to my opponent's 61. My opponent ended up not scoring any points whatsoever and grind them down, because as he was moving aggressively to the center of the table to score his direct assault, and I was going second, unfortunately, any losses that he inflicted on my army, I could immediately make up for when attacking his. Not to mention the fact that once the Ripper Swarms and Lictor are dead, the caginess of the way my army operates means that he typically doesn't have enough to shoot at that he can kill reliably. He has to fire into heavier targets like the Hive Tyrants or the Harridan, which don't really die easily and don't really give up grind them down points. Still a good game, and actually a little bit closer than the previous Custodes games I'd played, even against Triple Telemon lists. So it was good to see that, even though I think the Harridan is pretty advantaged in the matchup, it's definitely still a game, and some deft play from the Custodes player can turn it around. But with that, that moves me on to the final game. We had a couple undefeated players, so I was just on one of the undefeated tables, and I was up against Casey's Necrons. Now, this was a Novak-style Necron list, meaning it was focused very much on melee attacks, and I was actually taken aback during this game by how lethal the Necron melee profiles can be. That's not really something that you see out of Necrons very much at all, but once you start stacking all of the buffs on them, it actually gets kind of crazy. So the core of the list was an Outrider detachment with a bunch of Cryptothralls, a Scorpic Lord, as well as a Technomancer, a bunch of Immortals to hold objectives, 5 Canoptic Wraiths being led by that Technomancer, as well as 2 Heavy Destroyers to grab secondary objectives, some Lich Guard, Flayed Ones to do Retrieve Octarius data, and 3 Canoptech Tomb Sentinels. I love the inclusion of these guys alongside the Wraiths. It means the Technomancer using the Canoptech control node to give all of them +1 to hit is a really good sort of almost army-wide effect. He also has the failsafe Overcharger in order to buff up one of those guys to additional attacks, and in combination with the Novak abilities can make an enormous number of attacks out of the Canoptech Wraiths. Crowning the list, we also have the Silent King to give some reroll wounds in melee for some of these guys, and also just to be a late game beatstick and a relatively effective ranged attacker. Alongside those Canoptech Tomb Sentinels and the Heavy Destroyers, there is some measure of anti-tank in this army. The mission we played on for this game was Surround and Destroy, so another 6 objective mission, this time with 2 objectives oriented to the center and the 4 corner objectives way out in the corners. The big downside here was that the corner objectives are actually totally out in the open. Actually, almost all the objectives are out in the open, meaning that this was going to be a pretty bloody game from the get-go. This time, my opponent and I ended up deploying on opposite sides of the table, kind of setting up for the base trade. We both had Nova Elves on the left-hand side again, and I put all of my Gene Stealers and Hive Guard on that side with the Harridan and the Hive Tyrants there. I oriented some Rippers and the Smashy Hive Tyrant over on the right-hand side to keep off any tricksy turn 1 Veil of Darkness shenanigans, and constructed my castle on the left-hand side. My opponent's units on the left-hand side were equally light. He only had a couple of Cryptothralls over there to drop a Retrieve Octarius data. Speaking of secondaries, I took Engage Null Fronts and Grind them down. I felt Grind them down was going to be pretty good in this matchup because my opponent had so many small utility units. Between the 2 Heavy Destroyers, the 2 units of Cryptothralls, Immortals as well, in addition to all the characters and the aggressive melee units, I thought the Grind them down was going to be a pretty good pick. My last pick was much tougher because I didn't really feel like I had any very good options. I ended up taking Assassinate because I know I could probably score 10 on that, but that didn't feel great to me, and it also obviously requires me to be able to destroy those Necron characters, which is sometimes really awkward if they Resurrection Protocols themselves. My opponent and I both talked about who actually wanted to go first in this matchup, and we weren't really sure. In hindsight, we had both taken Grind them down, so the player going second was actually monumentally advantaged, since they could respond to however many kills their opponent had taken. This is the second time somebody had taken Grind them down against me, and I'm not sure it's really the pick against this list. Once you kill the Rippers and the Lictor, that's about all that's on the table you can easily take out. My opponent ended up winning the roll to go first, so for the 3rd time in a row, I was going second, but this time, I think I was pretty happy about it. He moved up relatively conservatively, pushing up the right-hand side of the table and setting up the Silent King to line a shot onto the Harridan. All 3 Canoptech Tombstalkers were in reserve, so they could jump in later in the game and potentially threaten the Hive Guard or the Hive Tyrants. So their shooting wasn't on the table, but between the Silent King's main ears and the 2 Heavy Destroyers, my opponent was able to sink 12 damage into the Harridan. In response, Harridan wasn't too happy about that, so he ended up hovering to stay relatively in the same position, moving up to squeak a line of sight onto the Silent King and knock both of his main ears out and sink 6 damage into the Silent King's throne itself with his first gunshot. I moved aggressively forward with my Rippers to spread out the anti-deep strike bubble so that my opponent couldn't place Tombstalkers in range of the Hive Guard or the Harridan. I moved very aggressively with my Hive Tyrants, which I'm not 100% sure was the right call, but I really wanted to start grabbing my opponent's objective secured units, and he had placed 5 Immortals on one of the center objectives. I set up so I could hit 3 smites on them, keep the Smashy Hive Tyrant and Swarmlord relatively safe from the Silent King's shooting, and then move one of the Hive Tyrants back behind a line of sight blocker so it wasn't in danger. Swarmlord ended up double sixing a Psychic test into the Immortals and just killed them so that the rest of my Spines went wide. I'm not 100% sure if this course of action was completely correct. It did mean that they were potentially open to the Tombstalkers coming in, and it meant that I had to kind of fight my opponent's melee assets in a knockdown, drag-out battle, but I think my opponent was setting up to Alpha Strike me anyway, and being able to take that fight on my terms, I think was the best course of action. I'm not 100% sure if I would make this play in the future, but in response, my opponent moved up very aggressively. All of his Wraiths and Scorpic Lord ran up the table to try to fight my Hive Tyrants. Lich Guard moved up on the right-hand side to clear out the Rippers on that side, and one of the Tombstalkers deep struck in to shoot at the Swarmlord. Swarmlord ended up bouncing a bunch of the ranged attacks off of his invulnerable save, thank goodness. Some random attacks started chipping additional wounds off the Harridan, and all of my Rippers died to ranged attacks in the Lich Guard blades. The Wraiths and the Scorpic Lord charged into the Smashy Hive Tyrant as well as the Swarm Lord, and this was going to be the fight to decide the game, I think. I was able to squeak a Heroic Intervention in on an overextended Wraith with my other Hive Tyrant to get him involved in the melee as well. And the Wraiths went first, got activated by the Failsafe Overcharger as well as the Novok Stratagem to give themselves +2 attacks, swinging 6 times a model, and in the command protocol to give them +1 strength. They ended up scything through the Smashy Hive Tyrant with an immense amount of damage. I elected to fight on death with the Hive Tyrant and swing into the Scorpic Lord, which actually ended up putting a wound and a couple of mortal wounds through his invulnerable save. That meant that when I interrupted immediately after the Wraiths have fought with the Swarm Lord, he was able to kill the Scorpic Lord before it got to swing. So the Swarm Lord ended up getting out of that combat unscathed. The Scorpic Lord tried to reanimate, but unfortunately the Resurrection Protocol's roll fails, and my other Hive Tyrant that had heroically intervened was heroically able to kill a couple of Wraiths with his Rending Claws. To be perfectly honest, I got a little lucky here. The play to fight on death with the Hive Tyrant is super duper dicey because he does hit on 4s because he fights on his bottom profile. He rerolls ones to hit, so typically you get 3-ish hits out of it, and my opponent procced the -1 to wound on the Scorpic Lord to make him more difficult to kill, but I was still able to sink that 1 wound through the invulnerable save to seriously damage him and put him in range that Swarmlord could easily kill him. I burnt most of my CP doing the entire combo, but it ended up working out. While I did lose a Hive Tyrant there, and a lot of my smites, unfortunately, that did mean that my opponent's melee assets had been committed, and I could deal with them as they were. The Harridan hovered again this turn, and moved up to attack the Tomb Sentinel that had deep struck in. He ended up shooting down the Silent King with his ranged attacks, then charging into the Tomb Sentinel to kill it. My smites and shooting actually went really well onto the Canoptic Wraiths. The support Hive Tyrant with his Devourers ended up killing one of them in the shooting phase, which was highly unlikely. And then between smites and the Swarm Lord's attacks, I was able to wipe the unit out. I dropped a Lictor on the top left-hand objective, and I used my Gene Stealers as kind of a rudimentary screen, I guess. I would have liked to have sent them in to start removing my opponent's objective-secured units, but I couldn't really afford to move off the objectives at this stage of the game, so they ended up just stringing out to screen out any Tomb Sentinel drops hitting the Hive Guard and hold 2 objectives themselves. I felt that had put me in a pretty good spot, but my beliefs were shaken to their core when the remaining 2 Tomb Sentinels deep struck in, and the Technomancer buffed them up, one of them sinking 12 damage through to the Harridan and leaving him on just 4 wounds. Both of the Tomb Sentinels ended up making their 8-inch charges into melee, because they get the +1 to charge from Novok, and together their combined efforts ended up killing the Harridan. Exactly. That was pretty unfortunate, but fortunately for me, I still had all of my Gene Stealers and 2 of my Hive Tyrants remaining relatively unscathed. The support Hive Tyrant did get charged by the Lich Guard, but fortunately I had cast Catalyst on himself, and he hadn't really taken much damage in the game so far, so he only took a paltry number of wounds from those Lich Guard attacks. Between his attacks, Swarmlord charging, and a bunch of smites and shooting attacks, I was able to wipe that unit out over the next battle round. And the Gene Stealers ran aggressively towards the Tombstalkers, who had deep struck in the center of the table, were able to kill one and wrap the second one to lock it in place. I ended up actually moving my Hive Guard this turn to get them onto the remaining objective on my side, which did mean that they didn't really do much of the shooting phase, especially since Swarmlord failed his onslaught on them, which was like super embarrassing. Now that put me up in a pretty good position. My opponent did have Flayed Ones who had moved up and killed a Lictor on my top left objective, but they were the only real remaining models that could contend with my primary objective scoring. I was able to kill them with the Hive Guard and start mopping up the remaining Immortals and random utility units that my opponent had hiding in his top right side, and closing that out to an 81 54 victory. Now, I didn't end up scoring super highly on a lot of my secondaries. I only scored 2 points on engage for most of the game, and I actually had missed it on the first turn because I think I'd mismeasured my Ripper Swarm movement, and I wasn't quite able to get them wholly on the opposite table quarter from my own. I did get all my points for Assassinate, but the big swing was grind them down, where going second and obviously having a lot more things to shoot at than my opponent had was absolutely punishing to them. I was able to almost max out grind them down. I scored 12 out of the possible 15, and my opponent wasn't able to score grind them down on any of the turns, so he ended up zeroing out that objective. He did get a couple points on engage and most of his Retrieve Rectarius data points, but that was all for him, and that put me 3-0 at the end of the tournament. Obviously, this was just an RTT, so it was only going 3 rounds, and that left 3 undefeateds at the end of the day. My list doesn't score super highly, but it is an absolute attrition monster, so I was able to get its 3 wins through. That put me at the bottom of the undefeated players, which, I mean, I'm fine with. I think winning your games is more important than scoring a bunch of points. But I do want to throw a shout out to the other players who went undefeated in the event. We had an AdMech mirror matchup in the undefeated table, which the players ended up dicing out and then leaving, which is like totally fair. Nobody wants to play that game. But big shout out to Sam K, who ended up taking second place in the event, also with Tyranids. So 2 out of the 3 undefeated Tyranids. And actually the other undefeated table was Sam also playing against Necrons. That one was Alex Ing's multi-Catan style of Necron. 4th place actually went to my round 2 opponent, Brady. So good on him for doing pretty well in the event as well. So overall, super psyched that the Harridan was able to go 3-0 in its first outing in the competitive scene. Now, I will admit, I did get some really good matchups in this event. I was able to dodge the boogeymen like Drukhari and Adeptus Mechanicus. There were several Adeptus Mechanicus players, as well as several new Orc players, which I'm not sure that I can particularly beat, especially going second into them. Drukhari also can put so much pressure on you if they end up going first that almost any of those big 2021 Codex matchups, you kind of just have to go first into. I do think that the Harridan list does have legs in those matchups, and there is the potential that it just like kills a bunch of Iron Striders or Drukhari Raiders if it goes first. So it's certainly a playable game, but it's not a great one. And I was lucky to dodge those matchups and instead get a bunch of relatively slow, very heavily armored things that the Harridan can kind of prey on. I do think that there's probably some tweaks to make it maybe a little bit more consistent. I imagine maybe you drop some Gene Stealers and try to fit 1 to 2 additional Lictors in the list in order to give yourself a good chance for Retrieve Rectarius data in those matchups where your last objective is very difficult. But anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.